Hello and welcome to On the Record. I'm Kylie Merritt. In just a moment we'll meet our panel, which is here to try and shed some light on just what's stopping women from reaching executive positions in the same numbers as men. But first, let's set the scene, because the debate and discussion over women in leadership roles is nothing new. In fact, it's been talked about for so long, you could argue it's become a little fatigued, that it's been replaced on the social agenda by other issues. Yet regardless of whether it's in the headlines, a core group of proponents continues to push for change, and new research suggests there's still a long way to go before that required level of change is met. The debate and discussion over women in leadership positions is nothing new. As I said, it's been talked about for quite a long time. Let's have a listen to some comments from Jane Hrdlicka, who's one of the authors of a major report into this issue, which was put together by Bain & Company in conjunction with Chief Executive Women.
Within corporate Australia, 3/4 of businesses believe gender diversity should be a strategic imperative. That's according to a study conducted by Bain & Company last year. And while the number of women at board level is rising, at the senior executive level, growth is flat. Within ASX 200 companies, it hasn't risen above 13% in a decade. Chief Executive Women has been commissioning research to find out why and whether it's changing.
The survey was conducted by Bain and CEW, 850 respondents across all companies of industry type, different size companies, but not small and medium companies, so tend to be ASX 200, maybe slightly off that register, some privately held companies as well, and people from the board all the way down into management. The key themes that came through the study this year are quite similar to last year's. If I just run through them, the first was, women are just as ambitious as men. So 2010, 2011, exactly the same result, which is great. Women are also prepared to do tough jobs. They're not afraid of doing hard work. It's not about that. The thing that did change this year is last year, 80% of the women didn't feel like they had a level playing field in getting into senior positions. This year, 85% believe they don't have a fair shot. And that's disappointing given all the effort that's going into improving. And half the men agreed with them.
Jane Hrdlicka is a member of CEW, a group executive with Qantas, and sits on the board of Woolworths. She moved to Qantas from Bain, where she was instrumental in this study. It questions what it is which stops women reaching the top. Top line, there are two schools of thought.
The first theme is a known topic around managing work-life priority changes as women start to have families. And so about 20% of the women believe that that's a big issue for them still, and they're not quite comfortable with the options that are available to them to still continue to progress in their career while doing part-time work, for example. And 60% of the men believe that's the big issue. The interesting thing is that 80% of the women believe that it is about the fact that they deliver great outcomes for their companies. Men and women agree that both do a great job in delivering results for their companies, but women do it differently.
Survey respondents broadly agree women's careers are slowed or disrupted by managing both work and family commitments, that women choose to prioritise family over work and choose to trade career progression for a more balanced lifestyle. Broken down though, 61% of men believe competing priorities is what limits women. Only 22% of women agree. The key style factors keeping the glass ceiling from cracking are senior men appointing candidates with a similar style, women underselling their experience, and a lack of value being placed on different perspectives.
Women are not as good at self-promoting. They're not as overtly confident, even though they believe they've got the capability. They do things in a way that is quite different and not typically compared one-to-one with what a man would have done. And so we are our own worst enemy, and we don't feel the same need to network in order to get outcomes. And so we end up in a position where we haven't communicated effectively what was driven by us, and we haven't engaged a network of people in helping us get to the next level of accomplishment.
Whether the problem is competing priorities, a perception of those competing priorities, or style differences, Jane Hrdlicka admits there's no easy fix.
I do think these are fundamentally culturally driven issues, some of them. And even flexible models require people to behave differently about people doing things differently. And so it does take time, but I'd hope that it isn't 5 decades before we can declare victory. You'd hope that over the course of 2 to 3 years, a concerted focus on this from the top in an organization with absolute commitment to change, with focus on the key people processes that create the tension around getting people of all different types, including women, through the corporate ladder. You'd hope that those things could be changed if we focused on them and we made some symbolic moves. It's hard for me to accept that over a 2 to 3 year period you can't see progress and meaningful progress. All the history and the analysis that's been done, either this study or others, says that's an issue that we haven't seen meaningful progress on. Cultural issues we haven't seen meaningful progress on. There's undoubtedly a chicken and an egg problem, and the issues that we find in our companies are driven by our society. So, but you have to start somewhere. I don't think you can start by trying to transform the broader population base. But if you create a different model for leadership in companies, and it is very clear that our leadership models need to allow for different types of people to come through, and that if we fundamentally believe that success requires diversity in leadership in our companies, that will flow through and change the way people think. And that should have an impact on the way people behave at home. And that should ensure that, you know, dads are as encouraging of their daughters as they are of their sons, and that mothers are as encouraging of their daughters as they are of their sons, even if they've chosen to stay home and not pursue a career. Those things have to change over time in order to, you know, change the feed.
Jane Herdlicker there, one of the report's authors and a member of Chief Executive Women, and I'm delighted to be joined in the studio now by Belinda Hutchinson, who is the current president of CEW and a very familiar face around the board tables of Australia, with chairman and directorships past and present at companies including QBE, Telstra, Coles Myer, Crane, AGL and TAB, along with not-for-profits and government boards. Richard Lee is also well known in corporate circles. He's the former CEO of Rothschild Australia and sits on boards including Ridley, Newcrest and the ARU. He's the current chairman of Salmat and the Australian Institute of Company Directors. And Melanie Sanders is a partner with Bain & Company and leads the consultancy's Asia-Pacific customer strategy and marketing practice and the Women at Bain program. Melanie is also a key author of the research, which we'll be discussing over the next half hour. Welcome to you all, and thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you for having us.
Melanie, I might start with you. It was interesting to look in at this research. It showed, and we saw in that package there with Jane, that the two key findings coming out of this about what's stopping women getting to the top: competing priorities, which I don't think really comes as a surprise to most people, and style differences. But what I thought was interesting was that style differences is actually the factor that you nominate as being more difficult to actually address. Why is that?
So Bain & Company, in partnership with CEW, decided to really get underneath what's going on, what's stopping women from getting to the top, and dig deeply into those issues. And as you said, the research debunked the popular myth that it's all about family, and in fact the core reason or the core issue getting in the way of women's progression is competing priorities and having to manage family and work. What the research actually showed was that for 80% of women, the much bigger issue is the fact that a woman's style is different, and that difference is not necessarily as valued. However, only 40% of men agree with that point of view, and that presents quite a challenging place to start a conversation between women and men about how to tackle style. And style in itself is quite a difficult thing for anyone to put on the table. It's not widely discussed, it's not widely acknowledged, and it's human nature for individuals to seek people who are like themselves. So it makes it very difficult for any woman to convince her boss, likely to be a male given the stats, that she's ready for promotion.
It's a cultural, a corporate cultural change that needs to take place. But one of the things this report highlights is that women who do have the skills and might want to move into another company and take a promotion or whatever, are going to be unlikely to do that unless they can be convinced that that corporate culture is actually set up to support them.
You're right. It's a cultural imperative for any organisation to want to convince women that they have an environment that embraces a diversity of styles. And at least in many of the organisations I talk to, and certainly in Bain & Company, we think there's a talent imperative. We want to see as many women as we can come into our organisation. It's an untapped source of talent for us. But what companies need to do is demonstrate real commitment with real proof points that they can point to that convince women that, yes, they are an organisation that embraces diverse styles and where women can be successful.
Let's talk about what this style thing actually means with real people. Belinda, I'll start with you. You know, you've had a phenomenally successful career at board level. What have you done? Is there something different about your style that's made you one of, you know, it has to be said, one of the very few women who's managed to reach that level? And you know, you've sat on such a large number of boards. There's only really a handful of you who've managed to do it. Is there something different that you've done? Something that you have?
Well, I thought it was really interesting, you know, when I sat down with Jane Hedlicker and Mel Sanders and talked about the report, and they talked about the different styles of men and women, talked about men being more promoter style, women being more collaborator in style. I thought, actually, that really does reflect how I was early on in my career. I really did, I think, you know, be an example of that collaborative style. But I think, you know, as I recognised as I went through my career, that probably wasn't the most effective thing for me to be only in that style, because I think you've really got to be a balance of promoter and collaborator. And, you know, there's sort of some examples that I think back on in my career. You know, when I started off in investment banking at Citibank, I remember going to a leadership program, and at that program we had to sort of set out your career goals. And the woman who led the program said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, you know, I'm in this corporate finance business, and I don't seem to be getting the same promotions or the same pay as the guys. You know, I don't understand this. And she said, well, you know, have you asked for a promotion? Have you asked for a pay rise? I said, oh, no, they'll recognise my talent. You know, you don't do that sort of thing. That's not the sort of thing you do. Well, actually, she said, well, actually, you do need to do that, and you do need to plan your career. So I sort of actually set myself a goal of what I would try and achieve, you know, 50% increase in pay in sort of 2 years and a promotion. Well, actually, I doubled my pay, and I was promoted within 2 years because I actually sat down and became more of a promoter style. And I think that's where, you know, it's helped me in my career by sort of trying to adapt my style to fit with the environment in which I operate. And I sort of talk about I can talk about other examples like that, you know, in terms of Macquarie, when it came to bonus time, every person puts up their hands to say they did the deal, when really there's a team of 5 or 10 who does a deal, where women often sit back and say, well, it was the team who did the deal. Well, in fact, I think, you know, I say to my children and I say to, you know, other young women that I mentor, you've actually got to put up your hand and say, well, yes, I did contribute to that deal. Yes, I was part of it. It's in a competitive world in which we operate, and I think we have to actually recognise that as women. So I think that's probably one of the things I have done in terms of changing my style to balance it out.
Rick-Lee, I'm interested in your view. You know, you're obviously a big supporter, and the AICD has been doing a lot of work on gender diversity. You've sat on boards. I wouldn't imagine the ARU and some of the mining companies that you've sat on, you know, are particularly overflowing with women at executive and board level. Have you found throughout your career that it's easier for you to relate to men? Would you ask that you have been guilty of promoting or bringing other men sort of into your circle just because it's easier?
No, I think certainly what I became aware of pretty early in my executive life, and certainly everything I've seen since has reinforced it, is that both between men and between women there is as much diversity of cultures and attitudes and the like. So the key issue, and certainly the key issue when you become a leader of organisations, whether it be as a senior executive or on a board, is to identify, to recognise that and make sure that you understand different people's dynamics, attitudes and the like, and put them together in teams that work well together and are aligned. And I think that in itself, perhaps in going back some years, women drew the short straw in that because there were more men generally in senior management. But I think enlightened managers recognise the value of women. I think it comes through in the research that's done in this space now on diversity and the value of diversity in terms of getting good outcomes. And I think generally that is now recognised and pretty well supported by research. And you don't get many people saying, no, that's not right, or I don't agree with it. One of the real challenges for leadership, whether at board or at management level, I think, is to work out the best way for people to, if you like, make those selections, make those judgments about talent, make those judgments about potential, because it isn't necessarily as clear-cut in making the key decisions on promotions and the like as we might all like to think. And at the end of the day, the results really are the test of whether it's worked or not.
Belinda, do you think there's, when we talk about gender bias, and you sort of touched on it in your comments earlier, but are women just as guilty as men? Are we sometimes our own worst enemy?
Well, I think that's what the research shows. We are, in many ways, our own worst enemy. And it is, I think there's the style, you can change your style, and it's just like you need to change the corporate culture to allow for women. Women need to modify their style, men need to modify their style, and that's quite possible. So I think we all have to work together, and I think that's what I think comes out of the research and out of some programs like the Australian Institute of Company Directors are running in terms of trying to help women on boards. It's about men and women working together and saying, yes, we both need to make changes. I had to change my style to a certain extent in order to achieve what I wanted to achieve. So I think you're absolutely right.
Okay, I want to talk about that theory that you say may just be being debunked about competing priorities, but we'll have to do that after the break. Stay with us. We'll be back in just a moment with more from our panel.
Does your mobile network come with black spots? Introducing Indigo Telecom, Australia's mobile phone operator dedicated to providing 100% mobile coverage wherever you go. Phones start from just $9.99 upfront, but with up to 85% off for approved applicants, thanks to the Australian government, you could end up paying just $149.85. Buy before Christmas and pay no service activation fee. Plus, get your first month's access charge free. Buy or apply today at participating Australia Post, BCF or Ray's outdoor stores while stocks last. Or go to nomoreblackspots.com.au for details. 100% mobile coverage wherever you go. Indigo.
I was born 100 years ago. I helped bring the world closer to home. I saw men search for dreams at Broken Hill and watched my best mates leave. But come what may, Australians always stood strong, like Don Bradman carrying an entire country on his shoulders. And me, I taught children to save and helped build homes, millions of them. I can't believe how often I saw the impossible become possible, or hope become history. I am Australian, and I am your bank.
Welcome back to On the Record. We're looking at research into what stops women from reaching the top within corporate Australia, and importantly, what companies can do to change the status quo. My panel is the Chairman of Chief Executive Women, Belinda Hutchinson, Company Director Richard Lee, and from Bain & Company, Melanie Sanders. Let's have a look at this issue, which the second sort of part, I suppose, that the research raised, which was this competing priorities. A nice way of saying that in general women are still the ones who tend to take more time out of the workforce for family reasons. Melanie, just in a nutshell though, what did this research show? We always hear the anecdotal stuff, but this is very different.
It's still a key issue, and it was against the different styles point, it was the second issue. So those two issues are still clearly the two big issues. It came out as a slightly smaller issue. About 40% of the respondents felt that it was the bigger issue. The interesting thing about the results are they skew a little bit by gender. So men felt that it was a bigger issue. About 60% of the male respondents were in that group versus only 22% of the women, surprisingly. And I think for many women, it's still very difficult, of course, to manage family commitments and staying on the career track, no doubt. But a lot of women have worked out how to do that. There are plenty of role models and templates out there, and organisations are making progress on flexible work practices. Nonetheless, I think we've still got a long way to go on flexible work practices. It's not part of the mainstream, and for many who go on them, they do feel as if they've sort of gone on a career dead end, and sort of how do you get back into the mainstream, make sure that your career doesn't sort of go on a slow. So it's still a big issue out there, but I think it's one that we've known about for a long time, talked about, and there is more examples of organisations managing that better.
Jane Herdlicker spoke about this in the package we played earlier. Richard, I'm interested to get your view on this, because it is a bit of a chicken and egg issue in that a lot of big Australian companies are doing very well at putting systems in place to support flexible working arrangements for both, mothers and fathers. But if the Australian culture is still very much from the home level, that men will continue on with their careers and it will be the women that sort of have to move things around and shuffle to do things. Is that, if that doesn't change, then are we going to get to the point that we want to get to, where, you know, you've got the companies doing the right thing, but the people within them are still struggling from that? Do you see what I mean? It's a real issue, I think, for most families.
Well, I think, I mean, just to tell a story about a different issue, but I think just as relevant 20-odd years ago, I can remember seeing some research on the impact on globalisation, of globalisation on companies. And I think people underestimated the importance of culture in operating successfully internationally. And so there was lots of examples, lots of research findings that reinforced that as companies were preparing to go out globally. And so you know, we've seen what's happened over the last generation or so. What it also found is that those cultural traits were effectively enforced in the first 5 years of someone's life. So if you hadn't got it by the aged 5, that was it. Now, I think that just tells you that these things won't be changed overnight, but I think by identifying them and by putting systems in place, certainly by, I think, the competitive pressures these days in business and the fact that you've got skill shortages and obviously companies are always in competitive markets, will force change as long as leadership is good and identifies it and looks at different ways of doing it. And I think one of the really valuable initiatives from the ASX in terms of their diversity guidelines was the requirement on companies to effectively report their diversity policies and disclose the results of those, because every company is dealing with this in a different way, in ways that seem to them to suit them. So you've got thousands of management teams wrestling with this issue. It is on the agenda, and they will be reporting the results of that. And clearly there'll be some initiatives that work very well and some that don't. And that information will be shared. And I think that in itself, over time, will be a big driver of changed attitudes. But it's going to take time.
Belinda, the ASX, as Rick mentioned, has been instrumental, as has the AICD, in the push for getting more women onto boards. But what we're talking about here is the next level down, and one underneath that, women in leadership positions at executive level, full-time people working within these corporations. What are the sorts of discussions that you're having at board level about the importance of making that happen further down the chain?
Well, we're sort of saying it's actually got to take place at the CEO level. The CEO has to commit to this. And I guess from a chief executive's women's standpoint, I guess what we say is there's a very strong business case. There's all the research that now shows that you really can't afford not to have women in your workforce and in leadership roles. You know, we put all these women through university, you know, 50% of graduates are women, we move them into these corporate entry training programs, we put all this money into them, and to actually have them leave the workforce is a huge economic waste. And also there's now some very good research internationally which demonstrates that if you have women in senior executive roles, your actually returns of your business are improved. And there's enough now really strong statistical results to show that and demonstrate it. So I think most chief executives now get that and get it very, very clearly. And also there's a real shortage of talent out there, and what makes a successful business is the ability to retain, you know, to attract and retain top talent. So I think once people get that at the senior executive level, most boards have got it, then you set targets. I'm not into quotas, but I think setting targets is important, because what you measure gets done. So I think what Rick's saying is absolutely right. We're now getting a focus at board level and at senior executive level which says we're going to set some targets, and those targets flow down through the organisation. So I think now you're getting those targets, people have to deliver on them. So it's part of their KPIs, so they have to every year report against them and see how they're going. So I think that's really helpful. Then, you know, this is a big jigsaw puzzle. This is not something that can be solved overnight. You know, it's a journey that we have to make progress on. Then you have to put in place your workplace flexibility arrangements. You have to deal with your cultural issues. So I think leadership training programs which deal with these issues. There's quite a few programs out there on gender bias, you know, where, you know, males and females go through leadership training together, and they get, you know, sort of examples of these things come up and put in their face, and they don't even realise that their style is actually you know, putting off women. and is not dealing with the underlying problem. So I'm actually really positive. I think there's a lot of good work going on, and I think, you know, we will start to make progress, but I do think it gets back to what you measure gets done.
We're running out of time, but I just want to ask, who's walking the walk particularly well? Is there an Australian company that you would highlight that you think is really leading the way on this?
I think there's a few companies. You know, Woolworths has got some very, very good gender diversity initiatives going on. All the major banks are doing a lot more now. I know at AGL we're doing a lot of work. We have a gender diversity big day out. We have a whole range of programs in place around workplace flexibility. QBE starting to do a lot. I think all major companies out there are starting to try and deal with this because, you know, there's a productivity issue. We need to keep women in the workforce. So I'm actually very encouraged. Rick, you probably see a lot more than I do.
Yeah, well, certainly all the boards I'm involved in have it as an agenda item that's looked at in a very clinical way, and certainly looked at in a manner to drive change. And I think it's a little early to tell which companies will move the fastest, but all of them are addressing their cultures internally, doing a lot of measurement of attitudes and the like, looking at identification of talent, looking at selection processes, looking at performance reviews, looking at reward systems, and doing all the things that I think will help to give the right outcomes. But it'll be a while before we can actually get good hard data on that, but I think we're heading in the right direction. I think there is some real momentum there.
And the research supports that. So when you look at how people are feeling, there is certainly improvement that you can see demonstrably that we are making the right steps and that it is improving.
Will it flow down? You all seem quite positive on this, that we're talking ASX 200 companies here. If this can be changed, and, you know, it's not going to happen overnight, is it something that will then start to flow down to mid-sized companies, to small business, do you think, if we can get that culture changed at the top?
I'm optimistic that it will. I think that often these things start with corporates, but then as people move out into small business, you know, that momentum goes with them. I also think that some of the research shows that actually small businesses are doing a bit better, potentially because the issue is much more in front of them than it might be in a large corporate.
All right. Fortunately, we've run out of time. We could sit and talk about this for hours. But Belinda Hutchinson, Richard Lee and Melanie Sanders, thank you so much for coming in. It's been a really interesting conversation.
Our
pleasure. Thank you. That is all we have time for this week. Carson Scott will be back in the chair next week. I'm Kylie Merritt. Thanks for your company.